were you always described as an old soul or the responsible one growing up? While these labels sound like compliments, they often mask a much deeper psychological reality. In many cases, this early maturity wasn't a choice, but a necessary survival mechanism. Psychology calls this parentification, where a child takes on adult emotional or physical roles. This lack of a safety net changes how your brain wired itself to handle the world. As an adult, those survival strategies transform into specific, deeply ingrained personality traits. You might find yourself constantly overfunctioning or unable to ever truly relax. Understanding these traits is the first step toward reclaiming the life you skipped. Today, we explore 5 traits developed by those who had to mature too early. Recognizing these patterns explains why you move through the world the way you do. To understand these traits, we must first look at why childhood development was interrupted. Children usually rely on adults for emotional regulation and safety. However, in unstable environments, this natural order is often reversed. 1. The hyperresponsibility trap begins when a child feels forced to manage their surroundings. Research suggests this happens when parents are emotionally unavailable, struggling with addiction, or physically absent. In these scenarios, the child assumes the role of the emotional anchor for the family. Cognitive psychology shows that this premature competence is actually a desperate attempt to create order. You learned that your value was tied to how much you could help or fix. As a result, your own developmental needs were pushed aside to ensure the household's survival. This survival state becomes your default setting even long after the crisis has ended. 2. The first major trait is an overwhelming sense of hyperresponsibility. Psychology shows that children who managed adult crises develop a compulsive need to fix everything. In adulthood, this manifests as feeling personally guilty for other people's negative emotions. Research suggests this leads to a dynamic known as overfunctioning in relationships. You likely take on the majority of the emotional labor, planning, and problem-solving by default. Because you don't trust others to handle things, you step in before they even ask. The psychological consequence is a chronic inability to exist without a task or a crisis. If there isn't a problem to solve, you may feel anxious or purposeless. This trait keeps you in a state of high alert, perpetually waiting for the next emergency. 3. This hyperresponsibility often evolves into a mental state called the internalized supervisor. Cognitive psychology suggests that when children must prevent household disasters, their brains remain in high alert. You essentially developed a radar system that is always scanning the environment for threats. This leads to a massive cognitive load, where your mind is constantly calculating what-if scenarios. Even during moments of rest, this internal voice checks for things that might go wrong. Psychology shows this prevents you from entering a state of true psychological safety or relaxation. The real-life consequence is a feeling of being on call 24 hours a day. You might feel like a failure if you miss a single detail, even if it wasn't your job. This mental fatigue eventually leads to burnout because your brain never truly goes offline. 4. The second trait common in those who matured early is a fierce, almost defensive hyperindependence. Psychology shows that if you couldn't rely on caregivers as a child, you learned to rely only on yourself. Asking for help feels dangerous because, in your past, vulnerability often led to disappointment or neglect. Research suggests this creates a deep-seated belief that other people are fundamentally unreliable or incapable. In adulthood, you might struggle to delegate even the simplest tasks at work or home. You would rather struggle in silence for hours than spend 2 minutes explaining the problem to someone else. This isn't just a work ethic, it is a trauma response designed to keep you from being let down. The real-life consequence is a profound sense of isolation, even when you are surrounded by supportive people. By refusing help, you inadvertently block the very connection and support you lacked as a child. 5. The third trait is a precision-tuned empathy that often borderlines on hypervigilance. Psychology shows that children in unpredictable homes must learn to read microexpressions to stay safe. You became an expert at detecting a shift in the room's temperature before anyone else noticed. Cognitive psychology calls this fawning, a trauma response where you pacify others to prevent conflict. While this makes you incredibly considerate, it comes at a high psychological cost. Because you are so focused on others, you often lose touch with your own emotional state. You may find yourself agreeing with people just to keep the peace, even when you disagree. Research suggests this leads to emotional exhaustion because you are constantly performing for your environment. In the long run, this trait leaves you feeling hollow, as if your personality is merely a mirror. For many who matured early, the simple act of sitting still feels like a moral failure. Psychology shows that if your childhood safety depended on being useful, rest becomes synonymous with danger. You may experience an irrational surge of guilt whenever you aren't actively crossing items off a list. Research suggests this is due to productivity-based self-worth, where your value is tied to your output. When you finally try to relax, your mind often floods with thoughts of everything you should be doing. Cognitive psychology identifies this as a lack of permission to simply exist without a purpose. This leads to chronic burnout because you never allow your nervous system to fully recover. You might even manufacture stress or chores just to escape the discomfort of silence. The consequence is a life lived in high gear, leaving you perpetually exhausted but unable to stop. The fourth trait, often developed, is a deep-seated compulsion for control over one's environment. Psychology shows that children who grew up in chaos use predictability as a safety net. When your early life was marked by instability, surprises of any kind feel like threats. Cognitive psychology suggests that micromanaging is actually a shield against the fear of powerlessness. You might feel an intense need to plan every detail of a trip or a meeting. If things deviate from the plan, it can trigger a disproportionate sense of panic. This isn't about being bossy. It is an attempt to ensure that nothing hurts you again. Research suggests this leads to strained relationships, as others may feel stifled by your rigidity. The consequence is a life lived in a state of high tension, where flexibility feels like a risk. The final trait often observed is the chronic erasure of your own personal needs. Psychology calls this self-silencing, a habit formed when expressing desires felt like a burden to others. As a child, you likely learned that household harmony depended on you having no needs at all. You became a master at accommodating everyone else, while your own boundaries slowly disappeared. In adult relationships, this often manifests as an inability to state what you actually want. Research suggests this leads to deep-seated resentment, even if you appear perfectly content on the outside. You might not even know what your hobbies or preferences are because you've spent years mirroring others. The psychological consequence is a loss of self, leaving you feeling like a supporting character in your own life. Breaking this cycle requires the difficult work of rediscovering that your needs are not an inconvenience. Psychology shows that maturing too early often forces the development of a false self. This false self acts as a functional, competent exterior designed solely to manage external stress. Cognitive psychology suggests that while this persona keeps you safe, it buries your true self. Your true self contains your actual desires, spontaneous joy, and unique personality traits. When you are forced to be the adult, these vulnerable parts are treated as liabilities. As an adult, you might feel like an imposter even when you are objectively succeeding. Research suggests this happens because your successes belong to the mask, not to you. The long-term consequence is a persistent feeling of emptiness or lack of direction. You may find it difficult to answer the simple question, who am I without my responsibilities? Reconnecting with your identity requires peeling back the competence to find the person underneath. Unlearning these survival traits begins with a psychological process known as reparenting. Psychology shows that you can consciously provide yourself the safety you lacked as a child. This starts by setting rigid boundaries to protect your time and emotional energy. Research suggests that practicing intentional incompetence can help break the hyperresponsibility trap. This involves choosing not to solve problems that aren't actually your responsibility to fix. Cognitive psychology also recommends mindfulness to catch the internalized supervisor in action. When you feel that familiar surge of guilt, remind yourself that rest is a biological necessity. Gradually, You will find that the world does not collapse when you stop holding it up. The long-term result is a shift from mere survival to a state of genuine self-authorship. Recognizing these 5 traits is the first step toward dismantling a survival mode that no longer serves you. Psychology shows that awareness alone begins to weaken the grip of lifelong habits. You spent years living for the expectations and needs of everyone around you. It is important to acknowledge that your early maturity was a brilliant adaptation to an impossible situation. However, research suggests that adulthood offers you the agency that childhood did not. You are no longer a child trapped in chaos. You are an adult with the power to choose rest. Choosing yourself is not a betrayal of others. It is a restoration of your own life. Remember, while you cannot change the past, psychology makes one thing clear: you can change how you live today.